Come on guys, let's learn about Docker arguments and environment variables. Docker support two types of variables. One is arguments and another one is environment variables. Arguments we generally add it while building the image, and env we add it while running the container. Arguments we generally add it inside the Docker file. Also it works with most of the Docker file instructions except instruction like cmd, because we already know cmd instruction will run while creating the container, not while building the image. Env also we can add inside the Docker file. Also we can add env inside the source code. While building the image, we can add ---- build arg flag to specify the arguments. Similarly, while creating the container, you can add ---- env to specify the environment variables. So this is about arguments and environment variables. But why do we need this? Instead of hard coding everything in source code or Docker file, if you want to assign the values dynamically, then you can utilize arguments or environment variables. Let's see those in action. Let's see env first. I told env we can add it in application code only. Let's do that now. I am modifying server.js file now. In server.js file, you can see application port is hard coded here. Instead of hard coding port 80 here, I want to use the environment variable. In Node.js code, I can mention env as process.env, then dot and the environment variable name. That can be anything. I'm adding it as port here. Generally, we add it in capital letter. Now I'm saving this file. Also, we can mention env in Docker file. Let's see how that works. vi Docker file. Then in Docker file, I can add instruction for environment variable. Instruction will be env, then the environment variable name that we have mentioned in our source code, that is port. Then we can add a default value here. I will add 80 only. Then in this expose instruction, instead of 80, I can add port. I can add expose port. But syntax for variables is different. I have to add $ also. Let me save this Docker file now. Let's create new image from this particular Docker file, and I'm going to add a new tag for this image, that is env. So let's run this command now. We got a warning here. You can see the format we should be used here, env key equal to value. So let me delete this image and modify the Docker file again. Image is deleted using docker rmi command. Let me modify the Docker file again. So here instead of space, I have to add equal to sign. Let me save this Docker file. Let me create the image again with env tag. Image is created now. Let's create a container now. I can use the same command that I used in previous session, but for the image I will add a env tag. Also here you can see the internal port is 80 only, because in Docker file I have mentioned default port as 80 only. If I want to override that, while creating the container, I can mention the --env flag. This is for environment variables. Then I can add an environment variable name, that is port. Then I can mention a different port here. So I have added 8080 port. I have to mention the same port here also. That is 8080 instead of 80. Now the host port is 3000 and the application port is changed to 8080. That's it. Let's run this command now. So container is created now, and in browser also application is working fine. And if you have multiple environment variables, then you can add multiple --env here, similar to multiple -v added in previous session. Or instead of --env, you can add -e only. Both work. And one more way is creating the .env file. So vi.env. Here you can specify the multiple environment variables. You can add port is equal to 88. You can specify the multiple environment variables in this particular file. And the file name can be anything. Generally, we name it as .env file. Then while creating the container, you can add --env file instead of only --env. Then you can specify the path of that particular env file. That file name is .env and file is in the same directory. You can mention that as /the file name. So that's it about env file. While building the application, we will have the different environments, and variables values in these environments can be different. For the same environment variable, in dev we will assign a different value, and in prod we will add another value. For dynamically assign the values, you can create different .env file for different environments. So that's it about env. Let's see the arguments now. We know arguments we can mention in a Docker file. We can't mention that in source code. So let's modify the Docker file now. vi Docker file. Here in env, we have added default port as 80. Now I want to modify this default port dynamically while creating the image, not while creating the container. For that, I can use argument. To define the arguments, you can use the arg instruction, then the argument name. Here also I can add a default value for this. Now in env, instead of hard coding this, I can add it as $default port. That is the argument I defined here. Now I can save this particular Docker file. Now while building the image, I can modify that particular argument also. And I will tag it as arg, then ---- build arg, then the argument name, then equal to. Now here you can add a dynamic value. Now I have added 9000 here. So let me run this now. Image is created now. Let me delete previous container, then create a new container from this new image. I have stopped and deleted the old container. Let me create a new container now. I'm going to use new image now. I have changed the tag of this particular image, and the application port should be 9000 now, because default port is 9000. Let me run this now. The container is created. For some reason, application is not working in the program. While building the image, I added as default arg instead of default port. So this is the issue. So before modifying that, let me clean up the container and the image. So stop the container, remove the container, then remove the image. Now I will correct this default_port. Let me run this now. It created the image now. Now let's create the container with the same command. Container is created now. Now the app is loading in the browser. So that's it about arguments. I quickly explain one more topic in Docker. That is dockerignore file. Like in Git, there we have .gitignore file. Here we have .dockerignore file. You can create this file in same directory as the source code. And if you don't want to copy any file in your image, then you can add those file or folder in this particular file. For example, if you run npm install in your host machine, then it will create a directory called as node modules in your host machine only. And if you don't want to copy those files inside Docker image, then you can add those in dockerignore file. Like this, you can add. So that is the use case of dockerignore file. So that's it for today. ENV and arguments, you can use it for dynamically assign the values, and you can use dockerignore file for ignoring the file or folders. So subscribe and check out other videos too, and keep learning.